At my sister's annual Christmas gathering, my brother-in-law Brian stood up from the head of the dinner table, pointed at my daughter Zoe, and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sorry, kiddo, we're taking the main family portrait in 5 minutes. Just immediate family in this one." The room went quiet. Not completely silent, but that peculiar hush when something uncomfortable happens and everyone pretends not to notice. Some relatives stirred their coffee with sudden interest. Others became fascinated with their dessert plates. I felt my face burn as I watched my daughter, 17 years old, my husband's stepdaughter, freeze in place, fork suspended halfway to her mouth, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She didn't look angry or hurt, just resigned. Like this wasn't the first time she'd been reminded she wasn't quite real family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Brian continued arranging people by the fireplace, his voice cheerful as he directed his children and my sister into position. "Marcus, stand behind. Your mom. Emma, move to the left a bit. Perfect." He glanced at Zoe, still seated at the table. "Would you mind taking the picture for us, Zoe? You've got a good eye." I waited for her to refuse, to walk out, to show any sign of the hurt I knew she must be feeling. But instead, she simply nodded, set down her fork with deliberate care, and stood up. "Sure," she said, her voice steady as she took the camera from Brian's outstretched hand. The evening continued. People ate dessert, discussed New Year's plans, pretended the moment had never happened. But when the time came for gift exchanges, my brother David stood up, placed his hand on Zoe's shoulder, and said, "Before we start, I think everyone should know what Zoe did for this family last winter when nobody was watching." He turned to address the room. "She didn't just save Cooper's life. She saved all of us from a loss we couldn't have survived." And just like that, every voice went silent. I hadn't wanted to attend my sister Kate's Christmas dinner this year. The last time we'd gathered, as an extended family, was 2 years ago, when Kate's oldest son had made a joke about how Zoe wasn't really my child since I'd only adopted her when she was 6. I'd left immediately, Zoe trailing behind me, her face a careful mask that broke my heart more than any tears could have. I swore, then I wouldn't subject her to that again. But this year, Zoe had asked to go. "It's fine, Mom," she said while helping me wrap presents in our living room. "I want to see Grandma Jean and Uncle David's kids. It's Christmas." Zoe is 17 now, not the small, wary child who came into my life 11 years ago. Her birth mother, my closest friend since childhood, had died after a brief, brutal battle with cancer, naming me as guardian in her will. Zoe's father had never been in the picture. It was just the two of us until I met Tom 5 years later. We married when Zoe was 12, and though he loves her like his own, my family has always maintained a subtle distinction. She's taller than me now, her mother's high cheekbones and quiet grace evident in the young woman she's becoming. She carries herself with a kind of measured dignity that seems impossible for someone her age, the kind that comes from learning too young that life can change in an instant. But she still calls me Mom without hesitation, something that felt like a victory the first time it happened, 3 years after I adopted her. I raised her through nightmares and grief counselors, through elementary school presentations about my family that left her in tears, through playground questions about why she didn't look like me. I became an expert at handling insensitive comments and intrusive questions. I learned that rage doesn't protect your child, patience and presence do. Some months were harder than others. Some nights I wondered if I was enough, if love alone could heal the wounds of such profound loss. But we built something solid, Zoe and I. Something that couldn't be labeled or categorized neatly on a family tree. When Tom came into our lives, he understood immediately what some of my own family still didn't seem to grasp, that Zoe wasn't my almost daughter or my friend's kid. She was mine, completely and without qualification. The legal adoption had been a formality, not the beginning of our bond. But my sister Kate and her husband Brian had always maintained a careful distance. They never said anything overtly cruel. It was always subtle. The birthday presents that weren't quite as expensive, the family stories that pointedly began with, "Since you weren't here yet," the way they'd introduce her as Sarah's adopted daughter, rather than simply their niece. 1,000 paper cuts disguised as casual oversights. When Zoe asked to attend the Christmas gathering this year, I hesitated. "Are you sure?" I asked. "We could visit Grandma separately." "I'm sure," she said, taping down a corner of wrapping paper. "I don't want to hide from them forever. And besides," she added with a small smile, "Uncle David and Aunt Rachel will be there. They're always nice." She was right about that. My younger brother David and his wife had never treated Zoe differently. Their kids called her cousin without qualifiers. They remembered her birthday without reminders. They made space for her in family conversations. So I agreed, promising myself I'd be vigilant. I'd be ready to leave at the first sign of discomfort. I'd protect her this time in ways I hadn't before. The day of the gathering, Zoe appeared in my bedroom doorway as I finished my makeup. "Can I borrow your silver earrings?" she asked. "The small hoops?" "Of course," I said, watching her in the mirror as she came to stand beside me. "You okay about today?" She nodded, selecting the earrings from my jewelry box. "I'm good, really." She put them on, tilting her head to check her reflection. "How do they look?" "Beautiful," I said honestly. The silver caught the light against her dark hair. "You look so grown up." She smiled, then hesitated. "Mom, if things get weird today, don't make a scene, okay? It's Christmas. I can handle—" I turned to face her directly. "Zoe, if anyone—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "You've got my back. But sometimes the best way to have my back is to let me handle things my way." I studied her face, so composed, so determined. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she replied, squeezing my hand quickly before disappearing. Back to her room. The drive to Kate's house was quiet, Christmas music playing softly on the radio. Tom had gone ahead to help set up, leaving Zoe and me to travel together. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. We'd always been able to simply exist together without forcing conversation, but I could sense her gathering herself, preparing for whatever the evening might bring. Kate lives in the same affluent neighborhood where we grew up, her house a sprawling colonial with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage. Christmas lights outlined every window, and a professional wreath hung on the glossy red door. Everything about it screamed careful curation, the exact opposite of our home's comfortable, lived-in feel. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Zoe straightening her posture slightly, checking her reflection in the visor mirror. Not out of vanity, I knew, but armor. Looking perfect was her defense against being found wanting. "Remember," she said as I turned off the engine. "I'm fine. No need to worry." "I always worry," I replied, attempting lightness. "It's in the mom job description." She gave me a small smile. "Then worry silently." We walked to the door together, my hand briefly touching her back, a gesture of solidarity more than guidance. She was carrying a tray of her homemade caramels, a recipe she'd perfected over years of Christmas baking. Kate opened the door before we could ring the bell, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. "Sarah, finally!" she exclaimed, air kissing my cheek. "And Zoe! My, you get taller every time I see you." "Hi, Aunt Kate," Zoe said politely, extending the tray. "I made caramels." "How thoughtful," Kate replied, taking the tray. The kids' table is all set up in the kitchen if you want to put your coat in there. Zoe was 17. There were no other teenagers present. The kids' table was for Kate's youngest and David's children, none older than 12. I opened my mouth to object, but felt Zoe's hand briefly touch my arm. "Thanks," she said smoothly to Kate, "but I'll probably sit with Mom and Tom." Kate's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, whatever you prefer." Inside, the house was picture perfect. A 12-foot Christmas tree dominated the living room, decorated in a coordinated scheme of gold and burgundy. Matching stockings hung from the marble fireplace mantel. Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. Tom spotted us from across the room and made his way over, giving me a quick kiss and Zoe a one-armed hug. "You're just in time," he said. "Your grandmother's been asking for you." Grandma Jean sat in a place of honor near the fireplace, her once imposing frame now diminished with age. But her eyes were as sharp as ever, lighting up when she saw Zoe. "There's my girl," she called. Zoe went to her immediately, bending to hug her gently. I watched as my grandmother took Zoe's face between her papery hands, examining her with undisguised affection. "Beautiful as ever," she pronounced. "Sit and tell me about school." For the next hour, the gathering progressed with superficial pleasantness. Appetizers circulated, drinks were refreshed, compliments were exchanged about decorations and outfits. I stayed close to Zoe without hovering, engaging her in conversation whenever she seemed isolated. David and Rachel arrived with their 3 children, bringing genuine warmth to the stiff atmosphere. I was helping in the kitchen when I overheard Kate talking to our cousin Anne in low tones by the refrigerator. "Just complicates things, honestly. Family portraits are already chaotic enough without adding extras." Anne's response was too quiet to hear, but Kate continued. "I mean, Sarah's the one who chose to adopt someone else's child. I don't see why the rest of us need to pretend." I set down the serving plate with deliberate care, my hands suddenly unsteady. Before I could decide whether to confront her, dinner was announced, and the moment passed. The dining room table had been extended to its full length, gleaming with Kate's best china and crystal. Name cards marked each place setting. I noticed immediately that Zoe had been seated at the far end, separated from Tom and me, between 2 of the younger children. Tom saw it too, his jaw tightening. Without comment, he smoothly rearranged several cards, bringing Zoe's place beside ours. If Kate noticed, she gave no indication. Dinner progressed with forced joviality. Brian, at the head of the table, dominated the conversation with stories about his recent promotion and their plans for a summer home in the Hamptons. Kate perfectly played the role of supportive wife, adding details at precisely the right moments. Their children, Marcus and Emma, 15 and 12, occasionally contributed anecdotes that their parents proudly expanded upon. Zoe ate quietly, responding, when spoken to but otherwise observing. I recognized her thoughtful silence, not shyness, but assessment. She was cataloging interactions, mapping the dynamics of the room. She'd done this since she was small, this careful observation before. Engagement, a survival skill that had become second nature. It was during dessert when the conversation turned to plans for the annual family Christmas photo. "I was thinking in front of the fireplace this year," Kate announced. "The lighting is perfect around 5 o'clock. Brian nodded. "I brought the tripod and timer so everyone can be in it." "Everyone who's immediate family, you mean?" Kate clarified, not looking at Zoe. "We're doing the core family portrait first for the holiday cards. Then we can do extended family after." The table went quiet for a beat too long. "What exactly constitutes immediate family, Kate?" David asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Kate sipped her wine. "Well, you know, me and Brian, the kids, Mom, you and Rachel, and your 3, Sarah and Tom." She waved her hand vaguely. The blood relatives first, then friends and additions in the larger group shot. Additions, David repeated flatly. I felt Tom's hand, on my knee under the table, a silent signal to stay calm. Zoe's been my daughter for 11 years, I said, keeping my voice even. She's as much immediate family as anyone at this table. Kate's smile was thin. Of course she's like family, Sarah. I just meant for the formal portrait, for clarity's sake. I think it's perfectly clear, I began, but Zoe's hand on my arm stopped me. It's fine, Mom, she said quietly. I don't mind. And that's when Brian made his announcement, standing up at the head of the table, directing people to the fireplace and asking Zoe to take the photo instead of being in it. I watched my daughter rise from her seat, taking the camera with steady hands, while something inside me crumbled. Not just for the exclusion itself, but for how unsurprised she seemed, how prepared. As if she'd been expecting this moment all along. She positioned herself a few feet from the gathered family, adjusting the camera settings with practiced ease. Everyone closer together, she directed calmly. Grandma Jean in the center, please. My grandmother frowned. Why aren't you in this picture, Zoe? A brief, uncomfortable silence fell. It's the immediate family portrait, Mom, Kate explained loudly, as if her mother's hearing was failing along with her health. Immediate family, my grandmother repeated, her voice suddenly clear and sharp. And since when is my great-granddaughter not immediate family? Kate's smile froze. Mom, you know Zoe is Sarah's— Finish that sentence very carefully, Catherine Ann, Grandma Jean interrupted, her frail voice suddenly steel. Very carefully indeed. The room went completely silent. Into this tense moment, my brother David stepped forward. He walked over to Zoe and gently took the camera from her hands. I'll take this one, he said quietly. You go stand with your mom. That was when Brian intervened again, his forced joviality strained but persistent. Hang on. Let's stick to the plan. We can do the bigger group photo after— After what, Brian? David interrupted, his normally genial demeanor hardening. After you've made it clear to my niece that she doesn't quite make the cut as real family? Is that the Christmas spirit you're going for this year? Brian's face flushed. That's exactly what you're doing, David cut in. And frankly, I'm tired of watching it happen year after year. Especially, he added, his voice dropping slightly, after what happened last winter. A strange tension filled the room. I looked between David and Zoe, confused. Zoe's expression hadn't changed, but her posture had stiffened almost imperceptibly. What are you talking about? Kate asked sharply. David placed his hand on Zoe's shoulder, his expression gentling as he looked at her. You never told them, did you? She shook her head once, a tiny movement. David turned to face the rest of the family, his hand remaining protectively on Zoe's shoulder. Last February, during that major snowstorm, I got a call from the hospital. Cooper had been in an accident. Cooper was Kate and Brian's oldest son, 19 and away at college. I remembered the snowstorm. It had shut down the eastern seaboard for nearly a week. Cooper was driving back to campus after that long weekend, David continued. Hit a patch of black ice on the highway and rolled his car down an embankment. Ended up trapped in freezing temperatures with a concussion and a broken leg. Kate had gone pale. We never heard about any accident. No, David agreed, because Cooper called Zoe first. All eyes turned to my daughter, who stood perfectly still, her face giving nothing away. Cooper didn't want to worry you, David explained. He knew you and Brian were at that couple's retreat in Arizona. He was dazed, hypothermic, and his phone was nearly dead. He managed one call and he called Zoe. As I did so, a knock sounded at my office door. Come in, I called, expecting my assistant with the morning reports. Instead, Elliot entered, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He closed the door behind him and stood awkwardly by my visitor. Chairs, as if unsure whether to sit without being invited. "Elliot," I greeted him, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, mussing it slightly, a nervous habit from childhood that his expensive grooming usually kept in check. "I wanted to talk before the meeting," he said. "To apologize, I guess." I gestured to the chair across from me, watching as he sank into it with none of his usual confident ease. The golden boy of Sullivan Enterprises looked distinctly tarnished this morning. "I've been thinking a lot about what Uncle Robert said at the gala," Elliot continued when I didn't immediately respond, "about how I've been taking credit for your work all these years. And he's right, Liv. I knew what was happening, and I went along with it because it was easier than standing up to Dad." It was a more direct acknowledgement than I had expected from my brother, who had mastered the art of charming deflection from an early age. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You must have known it wasn't sustainable. Eventually, people would realize you couldn't deliver without me." Elliot smiled ruefully. "That's the thing about being the golden child. Everyone's so invested in believing you're special that they don't look too closely at the evidence. Dad believed in me, or at least pretended to, and that was enough for most people." There was a painful truth in his assessment. Our father's approval had been the currency of value in our family for so long that we had all come to measure our worth by it, even Elliot, who had received it in abundance. "Besides," Elliot added, his voice dropping slightly, "I was terrified of failing. Every time Dad praised me for something you'd done, the bar got higher. I knew I couldn't meet those expectations on my own, so I kept taking the credit you deserved because the alternative was admitting I wasn't the son he thought I was." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. Behind the perfect suits and the practiced smile, I could see the insecurity that had driven him to accept our father's favoritism at my expense. Elliot hadn't been the architect of my professional diminishment. He had been another victim of our father's manipulations, albeit in a very different way. "What happens now?" he asked, vulnerability written across his features. "Are you going to push me out?" "I wouldn't blame you if you did." I considered the question seriously. I had the power now to exact a kind of poetic revenge, to sideline Elliot the way I had been sidelined, to let him experience what it felt like to be invisible in his own company. It would be justified, even satisfying in some primitive way. But that wasn't the leader I wanted to be. "No," I said finally. "I'm not going to push you out, Elliot. But things are going to change. The agreement I reached with Dad clearly defines our respective roles. You'll continue to be the face of client relations. That's genuinely your strength. You know how to make people feel valued, how to build rapport. But I'll be directing the strategic decisions, and the credit for my work will be mine from now on." Relief flooded his expression, followed quickly by something that looked like genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Liv. I know I don't deserve your mercy." "It's not mercy," I corrected him. "It's pragmatism. Sullivan Enterprises needs both of us, playing to our actual strengths rather than the roles Dad assigned us. We'll be more effective working together honestly than continuing this charade." Elliot nodded, accepting the boundary I had drawn. As he rose to leave, he paused, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "For what it's worth, I always knew how good you were, Liv. Even when I was taking credit for your ideas, I never doubted that you were the real brains of this operation." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, something I had been seeking from my family for longer than I cared to admit. I nodded, accepting it for what it was. "See you at the meeting," I said, turning back to my computer in dismissal. As the door closed behind him, I allowed myself a small smile. One by one, the Sullivan men were learning that the world had changed, that I had changed. No longer the overlooked middle child, the dutiful daughter seeking approval, the silent architect of others' success. I was Olivia Sullivan, Chief Strategy Officer, and it was time the world knew exactly what that meant. The executive meeting that morning was a study in shifting power dynamics. As my father officially announced my promotion and the restructuring of leadership roles, I watched the reactions around the table, surprise from those who had bought into the myth of Elliot's business acumen, knowing nods from those who had long suspected the truth, calculation from those wondering how this would affect their own positions. Through it all, my father spoke with the confident authority that had built Sullivan Enterprises, but there was a subtle difference in how he referenced me, a respect that had been notably absent before. When he finished the announcement, he did something unprecedented in my experience of Sullivan Enterprises executive meetings. He turned the floor over to me. "Olivia will now outline her vision for the company's strategic direction," he said, taking his seat. I stood, feeling the weight of every expectant gaze. For a brief moment, the old insecurity threatened to surface, the voice in my head questioning whether I was really qualified, whether I could command this room the way my father always had. But I pushed it aside. This was my moment, earned through years of work, of perseverance, of refusing to give up even when every force in my professional life seemed aligned against me. "Thank you," I began, my voice strong and clear. "Sullivan Enterprises has built its reputation on stability, reliability, and tradition. Those qualities have served us well. But the financial world is changing rapidly, and if we want to remain competitive in the decades to come, we need to evolve." I outlined my vision for modernizing our approach, leveraging technology to streamline operations, expanding into emerging markets, and developing new service lines that would appeal to younger clients with different priorities than their parents and grandparents. As I spoke, I could see the energy in the room shifting, skepticism giving way to interest, interest to engagement, engagement to excitement. 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, the same venue where Uncle Robert had revealed the truth about my contributions to Sullivan Enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on me. This time, however, I wasn't shrinking in my seat while someone else took credit for my work. I was the keynote speaker at the annual Southeastern Financial Leadership Conference, addressing a room full of industry peers as Sullivan Enterprises' Chief Strategy Officer. "Innovation doesn't always mean discarding tradition," I said, concluding my presentation on balancing heritage with forward-thinking strategies. "Sometimes it means recognizing the strength of your foundations while having the courage to build something new upon them." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. As I stepped away from the podium, I caught sight of my family seated at a table near the front. My mother smiled proudly, Uncle Robert gave me a subtle thumbs up, Nathan winked, and even Elliot was clapping with genuine appreciation. My father's expression was more complex, pride mixed with something that might have been wistfulness. Our weekly lunch meetings had gradually evolved from awkward, stilted conversations into something approaching real dialogue. We were not close. Too many years of damage stood between us for that. But we had achieved a kind of mutual respect. That would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Sometimes I even caught glimpses of the father he might have been if his own fears hadn't gotten in the way. "Remarkable presentation, Olivia," said Catherine Reynolds, CEO of one of our largest competitor firms, as I made my way back to my seat. "Your approach to the Morgan acquisition was nothing short of brilliant. I don't mind admitting I wish we'd thought of it first." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the compliment without deflection or qualification, another habit I had worked to break over the past months. My team deserves much of the credit for the execution, but I'm quite proud of the strategy. "As you should be," Catherine affirmed. "In fact, I'd love to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Your vision for regional expansion aligns with some initiatives we've been considering." We exchanged business cards with promises to connect the following week. As she moved on to greet other attendees, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Elena Zhang, whose family's international investment firm had been a Sullivan client for over a decade. "Olivia," she greeted me warmly. "Finally, the right Sullivan is getting the recognition she deserves." I smiled, appreciating her directness. Elena had always seen through the facade at Sullivan Enterprises, making it clear, in subtle ways, that she knew exactly whose strategies were benefiting her family's portfolio. "It's been an interesting transition," I acknowledged. "And long overdue," she replied. "The Zhang Group has always valued substance over appearances. It's why we've remained with Sullivan despite offers from your competitors." She lowered her voice slightly. "My father always said we were investing in Olivia Sullivan, not Sullivan Enterprises. He'll be pleased to see his judgment vindicated." The validation from a client of the Zhang's stature was particularly meaningful. Their loyalty had been one of the leverage points I'd used in my showdown with my father, but I hadn't been entirely certain they would follow through if I'd been forced to leave. Now I knew. As the luncheon concluded and people began to move toward the breakout sessions, my father approached. "Have a moment?" he asked, his tone carefully casual. I nodded, and we moved away from the crowd toward a quiet corner of the ballroom. He looked uncharacteristically uncertain, fidgeting with the program in his hands. "Your presentation was excellent," he said finally. "The board is extremely pleased with the direction you're taking the company. The quarterly numbers speak for themselves." Under my leadership, Sullivan Enterprises had seen a 17% increase in revenue and a 22% increase in new client acquisition, the strongest growth in the company's history. The strategic initiatives I had outlined in that first executive meeting were already bearing fruit, positioning us as industry innovators rather than traditional stalwarts. "Thank you," I said, waiting for whatever was really on his mind. My father cleared his throat. "Our 6-month agreement for weekly meetings ends tomorrow." "Yes," I acknowledged. We had maintained the schedule faithfully, through awkward beginnings and occasional heated disagreements, gradually establishing a new kind of relationship. Not the close father-daughter bond some might have hoped for, but a mutual respect that had been missing before. "I was wondering if you might consider continuing them," he said, the request clearly difficult for him. "Perhaps not every week, but monthly? I've valued our conversations." I studied him. This man who had shaped so much of my life through his approval and disapproval. 6 months ago, I might have seen this request as another attempt to control me, to maintain his influence over my decisions. Now I recognized it for what it was, a genuine desire to maintain the connection we had begun to build. "I think monthly. Lunches would be fine," I said. "But they remain personal, not business." Relief flickered across his features. "Agreed." He hesitated, then added, "I'm proud of you, Olivia. I should have told you that long ago, but I'm telling you now. You've exceeded every expectation I ever had for Sullivan Enterprises. Your grandmother would be very proud, too." The words I had longed to hear for decades landed differently than I had imagined they would. They were welcome, certainly, but they no longer carried the weight they once would have. Somewhere in the past 6 months, I had stopped measuring my worth by my father's assessment. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means something to me, coming from you. But I've learned that my value doesn't depend on your recognition of it." He nodded, accepting this boundary with a grace that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Fair enough. You've earned the right to that perspective." He glanced at his watch. "I should get to the Reynolds meeting. We'll talk soon." As he walked away, Elliot approached, having observed our conversation from a distance. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," I assured him. "Just discussing the future of our lunch meetings." Elliot nodded, falling into step beside me as we moved toward the exit. Our relationship had undergone its own transformation over the past months. The initial awkwardness had gradually given way to a more authentic connection as we learned to work together as equals rather than as the favored son and the overlooked daughter. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I wanted to run something by you before the family dinner tonight. I'm thinking of stepping back from Sullivan Enterprises." I stopped walking, turning to look at him in surprise. "What? Why? Things have been going so well with the new structure." Elliot smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes I wasn't accustomed to seeing. "That's just it, Liv. For the first time, I'm seeing clearly what I bring to the table and what I don't. I'm good with clients, yes. I can charm a room, build rapport, maintain relationships. But the strategic thinking, the vision that drives real growth, that's you, not me." I started to protest, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish. I've spent my whole life trying to be the son Dad wanted, the heir to the Sullivan throne. But these past 6 months, watching you in your element, seeing what real passion and purpose look like, it's made me realize I've never actually figured out what I want." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a calm certainty that surprised me. "What will you do?" I asked. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "I've been talking with Nathan about the business side of his practice. He's considering expanding, opening a second location, and he could use someone with my people skills to handle the administrative side while he focuses on patient care. Or I might explore something completely different." He shrugged. "For the first time in my life, I feel free to find out who Elliot Sullivan really is, outside of Dad's expectations." I studied my brother, seeing him with new eyes. The golden child who had benefited from our father's favoritism was choosing to step away from the path that had been laid out for him since birth. It was perhaps the bravest thing I had ever seen him do. "Whatever you decide," I told him, "I'll support you." "I know," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "That's relatively new for us, isn't it? Actually supporting each other instead of competing for Dad's approval." I nodded, thinking of all the years we had been pitted against, each other by our father's manipulations. Better late than never. As we parted ways, I found myself reflecting on the dramatic changes the past 6 months had brought, not just to my professional standing, but to the fundamental dynamics of the Sullivan family. The revelation at the gala had been like a stone, thrown into still water, creating ripples that continued to transform everything they touched. That evening, our family gathered at Grandma Sullivan's old house, the one she had left to Uncle Robert, who had preserved it largely as it had been, during her lifetime. It was a deliberate choice of venue for this particular dinner, symbolic of the shift in our family's center of gravity. The dining room looked much as it had when we gathered here as children for Sunday meals. The same heavy oak table, the same china cabinet filled with delicate teacups, the same faded photographs on the walls documenting generations of Sullivans. But the people seated around that table were not the same as they had been. We had all been changed by the truth and its aftermath. "I'd like to propose a toast," Uncle Robert said, raising his glass as we finished the main course. "To Grandma Sullivan, who always believed that truth was the foundation of any worthwhile legacy." We all raised our glasses, even my father, who had spent decades constructing an elaborately false narrative about his children's capabilities. "And to Olivia," Robert continued, turning to me with warmth in his eyes, "who has proven that authentic leadership is more powerful than any facsimile." "To Olivia," echoed around the table, the words carrying different meanings for each person who spoke them. For my mother, perhaps it was relief that the family facade had finally cracked. For Nathan, pride in his sister's long-overdue recognition. For Elliot, respect tinged with a newfound humility. For my father, well, his feelings were still complex, a mixture of pride, regret, and adjustment to the new reality. As conversation, flowed around the table, I found myself observing rather than participating, struck by how different this family gathering felt from the hundreds that had preceded it. There was an ease, an authenticity that had been missing before. Without the weight of pretense, we were discovering who we really were as individuals and as a family. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room for coffee, I slipped away to Grandma Sullivan's old study. It had always been my favorite room in the house. Walls lined with books, a worn leather chair by the window, photographs and mementos from a life lived with purpose and integrity. I ran my fingers along the spines of her collection, pausing at a volume of Emily Dickinson poetry that had been one of her favorites. When I pulled it from the shelf, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I bent to retrieve it, recognizing my grandmother's distinctive handwriting immediately. The note was dated just 2 weeks before her death, addressed simply to Olivia. "My dearest granddaughter," it began. "If you're reading this, Robert has finally felt the time was right to share certain truths with you. Knowing my son James, as I do, I imagine the revelation was neither easy nor willing on his part." I sank into the leather chair, my heart racing. This was no accidental discovery. Uncle Robert must have placed this note here deliberately, knowing I would likely seek out this quiet space during our family gathering. "I have watched you grow into a remarkable woman, Olivia, despite the constraints placed upon you by those who should have nurtured your gifts. Your resilience, your intelligence, your quiet determination to excel even when your achievements went uncredited, these qualities have filled me with pride and, I must admit, considerable frustration on your behalf." I could almost hear her voice, crisp and no nonsense, speaking these words directly to me. "I made Robert promise not to intervene until you were ready, until you had developed the strength and self-assurance to stand on your own once the truth was revealed. Judging by the fact that you're reading this now, that time has come." Tears pricked at my eyes. Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother had been looking out for me, planning for the moment when I would need to confront the realities of the Sullivan family dynamics. "Remember this, my dear. Your worth was never determined by your father's recognition or lack thereof. Your talents, your vision, your capacity for leadership, these were always yours, whether acknowledged or not. What matters now is what you choose to do with them." The final paragraph felt like a direct address to the woman I had become in the 6 months since Uncle Robert's revelation. The Sullivan legacy is not what James believes it to be, the accumulation of wealth, influence, and power. The true Sullivan legacy is the courage to live authentically, to use one's gifts in service of something greater than oneself, and to stand firmly in one's own truth, regardless of opposition. You, Olivia, embody that legacy more fully than anyone else in our family. Never doubt it, never forget it, and never let anyone convince you otherwise. It was signed simply, "With love and boundless faith in you, Grandma." I held the letter to my chest, overwhelmed by the connection across time. The grandmother who had seen me clearly, who had believed in me when no one else did, who had laid the groundwork for my eventual liberation from the narrative that had constrained me for so long. "I thought you might want some time alone with that," came Uncle Robert's voice from the doorway. I looked up, not bothering to hide the tears on my cheeks. "How long have you had this?" "Since the day before she died," he replied, coming to sit in the chair opposite mine. "She made me promise to hold it until you were ready, until you had found your own strength, independent of any revelation I might make." "She knew," I said, still processing the letter's implications. "All those years, she knew what was happening, and she didn't intervene." "She knew intervention would only reinforce the narrative that you needed rescuing," Robert explained gently. "Elizabeth Sullivan was a shrewd judge of character, and she understood James better than anyone. She recognized that you needed to develop your own resilience, your own sense of self-worth apart from your father's approval, before the truth could truly set you free rather than simply creating another form of dependence. I considered this, recognizing the wisdom in my grandmother's approach. If Uncle Robert had revealed the truth years earlier, I might have simply transferred my need for validation from my father to him. I needed to become strong in myself first, to know my own worth independent of anyone else's assessment. "She also left you this," Robert said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box. She was quite specific about the timing. "Not when the truth comes out," she said, "but when Olivia has proven to herself what I already know about her." I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a ring I had always admired, a striking emerald set in platinum, flanked by small diamonds. It had been my grandmother's signature piece, worn daily as a reminder of her own professional achievements. The stone caught the light from the desk lamp, sending green fire dancing across the room. "There's an inscription," Robert prompted softly. I removed the ring and tilted it to catch the light. Inside the band were engraved the words, "Your light is your own." "She had that added specifically for you," Robert explained. "The ring itself was given to her by her father when she took over their small business and transformed it into something significant, the seed that eventually grew into Sullivan Enterprises, though your father rarely acknowledges that part of the company's history." I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it fit as if it had been made for me. The weight of it was unfamiliar but somehow right, a tangible connection to the woman who had believed in me long before I fully believed in myself. "Thank you for waiting," I said to Robert, understanding now why he had chosen to keep his promise even when it meant watching me struggle. She was right. I needed to find my own strength first. He nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Your grandmother was the wisest person I've ever known. I never doubted her judgment, especially when it came to you." A knock at the study door interrupted our conversation. Elliot stood there, looking uncertain. "Sorry to disturb you, but Nathan's about to leave, and I thought you'd want to say goodbye." I rose, tucking my grandmother's letter carefully into my pocket. "I'll be right there." As Elliot turned to go, I called after him. "Elliot, wait. I want to talk to you about your plans." I stared at my daughter in disbelief. She had never mentioned this to me. "Zoe called me immediately," David continued. "We tried to get emergency services to him, but the roads were impassable. The storm was getting worse by the minute." "So, what happened?" Brian demanded, his arrogance faltering. David looked at Zoe. "You want to tell them, or should I?" She seemed to consider for a moment, then spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I knew where he was because we'd been texting earlier about his drive back to school. When he called, he was disoriented, but I got enough information to pinpoint his location. I called 911, but they said it would be hours before they could reach him, if at all." She paused, and I could see her weighing her words, minimizing her own role even now. "I knew he wouldn't last that long in those temperatures with his injuries," she continued, "so I drove there myself." "You what?" I couldn't contain my shock. "In that blizzard? Zoe, you'd only had your license for a few months." She gave me an apologetic look. "I knew you and Tom were at that conference in Chicago. I couldn't reach you. I took the emergency credit card and put chains on the tires like Dad showed me." Tom looked both proud and horrified beside me. "She didn't go alone," David added. "She called me first. I was snowed in and couldn't get my car out, but she came and got me. Drove through conditions that had emergency vehicles stranded. We found Cooper's car about 2 hours later," Zoe continued, her voice matter of fact. "He was unconscious by then. We got him out and into my car. The nearest hospital was closed due to the storm, so we took him to David and Rachel's house." "Rachel's a nurse," David explained. "She stabilized him while we tried to get through to emergency services. We kept him warm, monitored his concussion, splinted his leg. Rachel thinks he would have died from hypothermia if he'd been found even. An hour later. The silence that followed was absolute. Kate's face had drained of all color. Brian stood frozen, the family portrait forgotten. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Kate finally whispered. "Cooper made us promise not to," Zoe answered simply. "He didn't want to ruin your vacation. By the time you got back, he was recovered enough to return to school. He said he'd tell you himself when the time was right." "That was 9 months ago," Brian said slowly. Zoe shrugged slightly. "It wasn't my story to tell." I looked at my daughter with new eyes, not just her composure in this moment, but the courage she must have shown that night. Driving through a blizzard, finding her injured cousin, helping save his life, all without ever seeking recognition or thanks. Kate lives in the same affluent neighborhood where we grew up, her house a sprawling colonial with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage. Christmas lights outlined every window, and a professional wreath hung on the glossy red door. Everything about it screamed careful curation, the exact opposite of our home's comfortable, lived-in feel. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Zoe straightening her posture slightly, checking her reflection in the visor mirror. Not out of vanity, I knew, but armor. Looking perfect was her defense against being found wanting. "Remember," she said as I turned off the engine, "I'm fine. No need to worry." "I always worry," I replied, attempting lightness. "It's in the mom job description." She gave me a small smile. Then worry silently. We walked to the door together, my hand briefly touching her back, a gesture of solidarity more than guidance. She was carrying a tray of her homemade caramels, a recipe she'd perfected over years of Christmas baking. Kate opened the door before we could ring the bell, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. "Sarah, finally!" she exclaimed, air-kissing my cheek. "And Zoe, you get taller every time I see you." "Hi, Aunt Kate," Zoe said politely, extending the tray. "I made caramels." "How thoughtful," Kate replied, taking the tray. "The kids' table is all set up in the kitchen if you want to put your coat in there." Zoe was 17. There were no other teenagers present. The kids' table was for Kate's youngest and David's children, none older than 12. I opened my mouth to object, but felt Zoe's hand briefly touch my arm. "Thanks," she said smoothly to Kate, "but I'll probably sit with Mom and Tom." Kate's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Whatever you prefer." Inside, the house was picture perfect. A 12-foot Christmas tree dominated the living room, decorated in a coordinated scheme of gold and burgundy. Matching stockings hung from the marble fireplace mantel. Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. Tom spotted us from across the room and made his way over, giving me a quick kiss and Zoe a one-armed hug. "You're just in time," he said. "Your grandmother's been asking for you." Grandma Jean sat in a place of honor near the fireplace, her once imposing frame now diminished with age. But her eyes were as sharp as ever, lighting up when she saw Zoe. "There's my girl," she called. Zoe went to her immediately, bending to hug her gently. I watched as my grandmother took Zoe's face between her papery hands, examining her with undisguised affection. "Beautiful as ever," she pronounced. "Sit and tell me about school." For the next hour, the gathering progressed with superficial pleasantness. Appetizers circulated. Drinks were refreshed. Compliments were exchanged about decorations and outfits. I stayed close to Zoe without hovering, engaging her in conversation whenever she seemed isolated. David and Rachel arrived with their 3 children, bringing genuine warmth to the stiff atmosphere. I was helping in the kitchen when I overheard Kate talking to our cousin Anne in low tones by the refrigerator. Just complicates things, honestly. Family portraits are already chaotic enough without adding extras. Anne's response was too quiet to hear, but Kate continued. "I mean, Sarah's the one who chose to adopt someone else's child. I don't see why the rest of us need to pretend. I set down the serving plate with deliberate care, my hands suddenly unsteady. Before I could decide whether to confront her, dinner was announced, and the moment passed. The dining room table had been extended to its full length, gleaming with Kate's best china and crystal. Name cards marked each place setting. I noticed immediately that Zoe had been seated at the far end, separated from Tom and me, between two of the younger children. Tom saw it too, his jaw tightening. Without comment, he smoothly rearranged several cards, bringing Zoe's place beside ours. If Kate noticed, she gave no indication. Dinner progressed with forced joviality. Brian, at the head of the table, dominated. The conversation with stories about his recent promotion and their plans for a summer home in the Hamptons. Kate perfectly played the role of supportive wife, adding details at precisely the right moments. Their children, Marcus and Emma, 15 and 12, occasionally contributed anecdotes that their parents proudly expanded upon. Zoe ate quietly, responding, when spoken to, but otherwise observing. I recognized her thoughtful silence, not shyness, but assessment. She was cataloging interactions, mapping the dynamics of the room. She'd done this since she was small, this careful observation before. Engagement, a survival skill that had become second nature. It was during dessert when the conversation turned to plans for the annual family Christmas photo. I was thinking in front of the fireplace this year, Kate announced. The lighting is perfect around 5 o'clock. Brian nodded. I brought the tripod and timer so everyone can be in it. Everyone who's immediate family, you mean, Kate clarified, not looking at Zoe. We're doing the core family portrait first for the holiday cards, then we can do extended family after. The table went quiet for a beat too long. What exactly constitutes immediate family, Kate? David asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Kate sipped her wine. Well, me and Brian, the kids. Mom, you and Rachel and your three. Sarah and Tom. She waved her hand vaguely. The blood relatives first, then friends and additions in the larger group shot. Additions, David repeated flatly. I felt Tom's hand, on my knee under the table, a silent signal to stay calm. Zoe's been my daughter for 11 years, I said, keeping my voice even. She's as much immediate family as anyone at this table. Kate's smile was thin. Of course she's like family, Sarah. I just meant for the formal portrait, for clarity's sake. I think it's perfectly clear, I began, but Zoe's hand on my arm stopped me. It's fine, Mom, she said quietly. I don't mind. And that's when Brian made his announcement, standing up at the head of the table, directing people to the fireplace, and asking Zoe to take the photo instead of being in it. I watched my daughter rise from her seat, taking the camera with steady hands, while something inside me crumbled. Not just for the exclusion itself, but for how unsurprised she seemed. How prepared. As if she'd been expecting this moment all along. The revelation about what had happened last winter hung in the air, electric with tension. Everyone was staring at Zoe now, but her expression remained composed, almost serene. There was no triumph in her posture, no satisfaction at having stunned the room into silence. Just that same quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of subtle exclusion. Cooper called you? Kate asked finally, her voice small. Not emergency services? Not us? His phone was almost dead, Zoe explained, gently. He only had time for one call. And he chose you, Brian stated flatly, as if still processing this fact. Kate turned to Cooper, who had been silent throughout the revelation. He was home from college for the holidays, his lanky frame folded awkwardly in his chair. Why? Didn't you tell us? She demanded, her voice caught between anger and fear. Cooper shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want to worry you. And then, It just never seemed like the right time. He looked at Zoe with naked gratitude. She saved my life, Mom. It wasn't just the accident. The doctors said if she and Uncle David hadn't found me when they did, I would have died from exposure. Your daughter drove through a blizzard to save our son, Brian said slowly, turning to me. And we were going to make her take our family photo instead of being in it. The silence that followed was thick with realization. I wanted to say something cutting, something that would make Kate and Brian feel the full weight of their behavior. But before I could, Grandma Jean spoke up. I think, she said deliberately, that we need to retake our understanding of what family means. Her gaze, still sharp despite her 93 years, swept the room. A family isn't made by blood alone. It's made by who shows up, by who stays, by who drives through a snowstorm when you need them most. David moved to stand beside Zoe. Cooper isn't the only one she's helped, he said. When Ben broke his arm last year, Zoe is the one who sat with him in the emergency room for 5 hours while Rachel and I were stuck at work. She's the one who taught Lily how to read when she was struggling in 1st grade. She's the one who remembers everyone's birthdays, who makes those caramels from scratch every Christmas. I watched my daughter's face as these truths were spoken aloud. She looked almost embarrassed by the attention, uncomfortable with praise, for things she considered unremarkable, things she did simply because that's who she was. I don't understand, Kate said, looking genuinely confused. Why go to such lengths for a family that hasn't always included you? Zoe considered this for a moment. Because that's not how family works, she said finally, her voice soft but clear. You don't only show up for people who deserve it. You show up because they need you. The profound simplicity of her answer seemed to render Kate speechless. I saw something shift in her expression, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. Cooper, Brian said suddenly, go get your sister and brother. I want to take a new family portrait, the real one this time. Cooper nodded and disappeared to find his siblings. Brian turned to David. Would you set up the camera again? I think we need a do-over. As people began to move toward the fireplace, rearranging themselves, I watched Zoe. She stood slightly apart, uncertain if this change of heart included her. Kate noticed too, and after a moment's hesitation, she did something I hadn't seen in years. She walked over to Zoe and held out her hand. We can't take a family portrait without the person who kept our family whole, she said, her voice catching slightly. Please. For a moment I thought Zoe might refuse, and who could blame her? But instead, she took Kate's offered hand and allowed herself to be led to the center of the group. Where should I stand? She asked. Right here, Grandma Jean said firmly, patting the space beside her chair. With me. As David set the timer and hurried to join the group, I found myself standing beside Zoe, my arm around her shoulders. In that moment, surrounded by the family that had so often made her feel separate, I felt a fierce pride unlike anything I'd known before. Not just because she had saved Cooper's life, though that act of courage would have been enough, but because of who she was. Because even when treated as less than, she had chosen to be more. The camera flashed, capturing all of us. Not perfect, not whole, but perhaps beginning to heal. Later that night, after presents had been opened and goodbyes said, we drove home in companionable silence. The revelation had changed something in the family dynamic, but it was too soon to know if that change would last beyond the shock and gratitude of the moment. You should have told me, I said finally, about Cooper, about the storm. Zoe looked out the window at the passing Christmas lights. I didn't want you to worry retroactively. It was already over by the time you got home from Chicago. That's not the point, Zoe. You could have been killed trying to reach him. She turned to me then. Would you have stayed home if it had been me stranded in that storm? If I'd called you instead of Cooper calling me? The question caught me off guard. Of course not. I would have come for you no matter what. That's all I did, she said simply. What you taught me to do. I felt my eyes sting with unexpected tears. When did you become so brave? I asked, my voice slightly unsteady. She shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Probably around the time you decided to take in a traumatized 6-year-old who wasn't your responsibility. You were always my responsibility, I corrected gently. From the moment your mother asked me to be your godmother. From the first time I held you as a baby. That's my point, she said. You chose me before you had to, before the cancer, before the will. You chose to love me when it wasn't convenient or expected. She paused, looking back out the window. I learned bravery from watching you. When we arrived home, the house welcomed us with its comfortable imperfection. Our Christmas tree was smaller than Kate's, decorated with a mismatched collection of ornaments, many made by Zoe over the years. The stockings didn't match. The lights weren't perfectly spaced, but it was ours, this home we'd built together. Tom was already in bed when we got in, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Hot chocolate in the thermos. Proud of both my girls tonight. Zoe smiled when she read it. Dad always knows, doesn't he? Knows what? When we need to hear something good. She poured the hot chocolate into 2 mugs, handing one to me. I'm sorry I never told you. About Cooper. I wasn't trying to keep secrets. I know, I said, taking the warm mug. You were trying to protect me from worry, the same way I've tried to protect you from hurt. But Zoe, I don't need protection from knowing who you really are. Even the scary parts, especially those. She nodded, understanding. Then, I should probably tell you about the application. What application? She took a deep breath. I applied for an EMT certification course, the one that starts next summer after graduation. I've been saving from my tutoring money. I stared at her, surprised. Is this because of what happened? With Cooper? Partly, she admitted, but also because I want to be the person who shows up when things are falling apart. I want to help put them back together. I thought about the night she'd driven through a blizzard to save her cousin. About all the times she'd quietly stepped up for others without fanfare or expectation of thanks. About how she'd turned years of exclusion not into bitterness, but into a deeper understanding of what belonging truly meant. You already are that person, Zoe, I said softly. You always have been. She smiled at that, a rare, unguarded smile that reminded me suddenly of the small girl she'd once been. Thanks, Mom. We drank our hot chocolate in comfortable silence, the Christmas tree lights casting colorful shadows across the kitchen. Tomorrow would bring questions about whether Kate and Brian's change of heart would last, about what this new understanding might mean for our fractured family. But for tonight, in this quiet moment, there was peace in knowing that Zoe had not been diminished by their treatment of her. She had been refined by it. The next morning, I woke to find Zoe already in the kitchen, making pancakes with Tom. They were laughing about something, their easy rapport a testament to the bond they'd built over the years. I stood in the doorway watching them for a moment, struck by how much love there was in this unconventional family of ours. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Kate. The photographer just sent the family portrait. I'm having it. Framed for Mom. Can we talk sometime this week? Just you and me? I showed the message to Zoe. What do you think? Should I meet with her? She considered this while flipping a pancake. I think Aunt Kate has a lot to process right now. Finding out your son almost died and you never knew about it. That's got to be hard. That's not an answer, I pointed out. She smiled. I think forgiveness and second chances are part of what makes a family work. Even when it's hard, especially then. Tom nodded approvingly. Wise beyond her years, this one. Wonder where she gets that from. I replied, joining them at the stove. Later that morning, as we cleaned up breakfast, the doorbell rang. To our surprise, Cooper stood on the porch, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Hey," he said when Zoe opened the door. "Can we talk?" I watched from the kitchen as they sat on the front steps, their breath visible in the cold December air. They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation too private for me to hear. When they finally came inside, Cooper looked lighter somehow, and Zoe's eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. "Cooper's going to help me with my EMT application," she told me as he left. "He switched his major to pre-med after the accident. Says he wants to pay forward what I did for him." I hugged her then, this remarkable young woman who had turned exclusion into inclusion, who had responded to being pushed away by drawing closer, who had saved not just a life, but perhaps a family too. "You know what I think?" I said, pulling back to look at her. "I think you're changing what family means to all of us, one brave choice at a time." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly my point," I replied. "Family isn't about who has to include you. It's about who chooses to show up when it matters. And you, Zoe Edwards, have shown up more consistently than anyone I know." That evening, as we prepared for a quiet dinner at home, another text came through, this time with a photo attached. It was the family portrait from the night before, everyone gathered around Grandma Jean's chair. But what caught my attention was where Zoe stood, not at the edges, not slightly apart, but in the very center, her hand on her grandmother's shoulder, surrounded by the family that had taken too long to recognize her place among them. Kate had captioned it simply, "The Fiao, real family portrait. Thank you for not giving up on us." I showed it to Zoe, who studied it thoughtfully. "What do you think?" I asked. "Is it too little? Too late?" She considered this for a moment, then handed the phone back to me. "I think family is a work in progress," she said finally. "Always unfinished, always becoming." And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, whether Kate and Brian's newfound appreciation lasted or faded with time, Zoe would be okay. Not because she needed their acceptance, but because she had already accepted herself. She knew her worth was not determined by who claimed her, but by who she chose to be. The girl who drove through a blizzard to save a cousin who had never fully embraced her. The girl who understood that family isn't defined by blood or boundaries, but by brave, recurring choices to show up when it matters most. My daughter, my teacher, my family. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, and I woke to find the world transformed by several inches of fresh snow. It blanketed our yard, softened the edges of the fence, created a stillness that felt appropriate after the revelations of Christmas evening. I made coffee and watched the sunrise paint the snow in shades of pink and gold, thinking about courage and second chances. I hadn't responded to Kate's text yet. Part of me wanted to hold tight to the righteous anger I'd carried for years. It felt protective, a shield against future hurts. But another part, perhaps the wiser part, recognized the opportunity for healing, not just for Kate and me, but for our entire family. "Morning," Zoe said, padding into the kitchen in thick socks and an oversized sweater. "Did you see the snow?" "It's beautiful," I agreed, pouring her a cup of coffee. At 17, she was still new to the ritual, treating each cup with a solemnity. That made me smile. "Sleep okay?" She nodded, doctoring her coffee with far too much cream. "Dreamed about the day we built that epic snow fort. Remember? The winter after you and Dad got married." I did remember. Tom had spent hours with her, constructing a palace of snow complete with tunnels and towers. She'd been 12 then, still shy around him, still careful with her trust. But something had shifted that day, in the collaborative work of building something together. "That was a good day," I said. It was the first time I felt like we might really be a family, she admitted, looking into her coffee. The three of Pao. Us. I reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. We were always a family from the moment I brought you home. Tom just made it bigger. I know that now, she said. But back then, I thought family was something you had to be born into. Something that could be taken away. She looked up with a small smile. I was wrong about a lot of things. You were 6, I reminded her. You'd just lost everything familiar. Being wrong about how the world works was your right. She shrugged. Still, I'm glad I was wrong about family being something fixed and unchangeable. I'm glad it's something we get to build instead. The wisdom in her words struck me anew. My daughter had understood something fundamental that many adults, including my sister, still struggled to grasp. Family wasn't a static entity defined by genetics or legal documents. It was an ongoing creation, built choice by choice, day by day. Have you decided about Aunt Kate? She asked, nodding toward my phone on the counter. Are you going to meet with her? I sighed. I'm thinking about it. Part of me is still angry. That's fair, Zoe said. She's got a lot to make up for. But, her smile widened. I didn't say but. Your face did. She laughed. Okay, but I think people can change when they see the truth clearly enough. Sometimes they just need help seeing it. When did you become so forgiving? I asked, genuinely curious. She considered this for a moment. Probably around the time I realized holding grudges takes more energy than I'm willing to spend. She drained her coffee. Besides, I'm not saying forgive and forget. I'm saying give her a chance to be better now that she knows better. Tom entered the kitchen then, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Are you two solving world peace this early? In the morning? Just family politics, I replied. Coffee's fresh. He poured himself a cup, then looked out at the snow-covered yard. Perfect day for sledding at Riverside Park, he observed, if anyone's interested. Zoe's face lit up. Like when I was 12? Exactly like that, he agreed. Though I'm thinking you're big enough now that I won't have to pull you back up the hill every time. Don't count on it, she grinned. The table quieted, all eyes turning to her. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began, her voice steady despite what I knew must be nervousness. Having everyone here means more to me than I can say. She paused, looking around the table, making eye contact with each person. I wanted you all here because I have something important to share, something I've been thinking about for a long time. A flutter of anxiety moved through me. She hadn't mentioned any announcement to me or Tom. What was she planning? As most of you know, she continued, I came into this family in an unconventional way. When my birth mother died, Sarah chose to become my guardian, my parent, when she could have chosen a much easier path. Her eyes found mine, full of a love so pure it made my chest ache. She taught me that family isn't just biology, it's choice. Daily, deliberate choice to show up for each other, to see each other clearly and love anyway. She turned to Tom. And then Dad came along and chose us both, even though I was a pretty suspicious 12-year-old at the time. A ripple of gentle laughter moved around the table. He chose to build something with us, even when it wasn't easy. Her gaze swept the gathering again. Some of you embraced me from the beginning. She nodded toward David and Rachel, toward Grandma Jean. Some of you have taken longer to see me as family. Her eyes rested briefly on Kate and Brian, but without accusation. And that's okay, because what I've learned is that family isn't static. It's always becoming, always growing, always making room for new understanding. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded document. Which is why I've made a decision. For my 18th birthday, I wanted something meaningful, something that represents who I am and who I choose to be. She unfolded the paper, holding it so Tom and I could see. It was a legal form I recognized immediately, a petition for adult adoption. "I'm asking Dad, Tom, to legally adopt me," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Not because anything needs to change between us, not because papers make a family real, but because I want the world to know what we already know. That family is who chooses you, every day, even when it's hard. Especially then." Tom's eyes filled with tears. "Zoe," he managed, "are you sure?" She nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." She looked around the table again. "I wanted you all to witness this moment, to be part of this choice. Because that's what family does. It witnesses our most important moments. It holds them sacred." The silence that followed was profound, not uncomfortable, but full of something reverent. Then Grandma Jean spoke up, her voice quavering. "With age, but clear with conviction." "Well, it's about time," she declared, causing laughter to ripple around the table. "Tom's been your father in every way that matters since you were 12 years old. Might as well make it official." "Here, here," David agreed, raising his glass. "To choices that make a family." "To choices," the table echoed, glasses lifting. As conversation resumed and dessert was served, I watched the faces around our table, some familiar and beloved, others still becoming known to me again after years of distance. I saw Kate leaning toward Zoe, showing her something in the portfolio she'd brought, saw Cooper deep in conversation with Tom about something that had them both gesturing enthusiastically, saw Brian actually listening to Rachel's story about her hospital work, asking thoughtful questions. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was fixed in the simplistic way of fairy tales. But something had shifted fundamentally in our family constellation. Something had opened that had long been closed. Later, after guests had departed and the house was quiet again, I found Zoe on the back porch, looking up at the stars. I joined her, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders against the February chill. "That was quite an announcement," I said softly. "Why didn't you tell us beforehand?" She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I needed to say it in front of everyone. For me, but also for them. To show them what real family looks like." "And what does it look like?" I asked. She considered this, her face thoughtful in the dim light. "It looks like courage," she said finally. "The courage to choose each other, even when it's not the easy path. The courage to forgive when it would be simpler to hold grudges. The courage to see each other clearly and stay anyway." I pulled her closer, overwhelmed by the wisdom of this child-turned-woman beside me. "When did you get so insightful about what makes a family work?" She smiled up at me. "I had good teachers. You and Dad showed me every day what it means to choose someone, what it means to stay when things get hard." She paused. "And I guess almost losing Cooper taught me something too. That life is too short to hold on to hurt when healing is possible." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching our breath form clouds in the cold air. Finally, I asked the question that had been turning in my mind all evening. "Are you disappointed that it took something as dramatic as saving Cooper's life for Kate and Brian to really see you, to include you?" Zoe considered this carefully. "No," she said finally, "because it wasn't really about saving Cooper. That just forced them to pay attention long enough to see what was already true." "Which was?" "That I've always been part of this family," she said simply. "Whether they acknowledged it or not, my belonging wasn't dependent on their recognition. It existed anyway." The profound truth of her words settled over me like the blanket around our shoulders, warming, protective, real. She had articulated something essential that had taken me decades longer to understand. That worthiness isn't bestowed by others. It exists independently of anyone's ability or willingness to see it. The photo meant something, though, didn't it? I asked. remembering the family portrait where she'd finally been included, standing in the center instead of being excluded. Of course it did, she nodded. Being seen matters. Being included matters. I'm not saying it doesn't. She turned to face me fully. But what I've learned is that being excluded from a photo doesn't exclude me from being family. Only I get to define that. Only I get to decide who I am and where I belong. In that moment, I saw the full measure of what we'd built together over 11 years. Not just a relationship between mother and daughter, but a foundation of self-worth, so solid that even years of subtle exclusion couldn't shake it. A knowledge of belonging so fundamental that it could withstand being temporarily unseen. "You know what I think?" I said finally. "I think saving Cooper wasn't the most courageous thing you did last winter." At her questioning look, I continued. "The most courageous thing was keeping it to yourself, not using it as currency to buy acceptance, not wielding it as a weapon against those who had hurt you." She looked thoughtful. "I never saw it that way. That's why it matters," I told her. "Because true character isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you do when no one is." "And you, Zoe Edwards, soon to be Zoe Edwards Mitchell if Tom has his way with the paperwork, have shown extraordinary character every single day I've known you." Her eyes glistened in the dim light. "I had a good example to follow." "We learned together," I corrected gently. "And we'll keep learning. That's what family does." As we headed inside, arm in arm against the chill, I thought about the journey we'd traveled. From the terrified, grieving child and the overwhelmed new guardian to the wise young woman and the mother who had grown alongside her. About how exclusion had ultimately led to a deeper, more meaningful inclusion. About how sometimes the most beautiful things grow from places of pain. Inside, Tom was waiting with 3 mugs of hot chocolate and a stack of old photo albums. "Thought we might take a trip down memory lane," he suggested, "since it's officially a landmark birthday." Zoe curled up between us on the couch as we flipped through images of our shared past, camping trips and school plays, holiday gatherings, and ordinary moments captured in time. The 3 of us, building a family choice by choice, day by day. "Look at this one," Tom said, pointing to a photo of 12-year-old Zoe standing beside a magnificent snow fort, her face flushed with cold and pride. "Remember that day? It was the first time I felt like we might really be a family," Zoe recalled, echoing what she'd told me days earlier. The 3 of us. Tom's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We were always a family, from the moment I met you both. The paperwork is just catching up to reality." As we continued through the albums, I noticed something I'd never fully registered before. In nearly every photo, regardless of the setting or occasion, the 3 of us were turned slightly toward each other, a unconscious orientation that spoke volumes about where our true center had always been. Not in external validation or recognition, but in the connections we'd built together. "This is my favorite," Zoe said suddenly, pointing to a candid shot from about 2 years ago. We were at the kitchen table, heads bent over some project, completely absorbed in whatever we were creating together. Nothing special, nothing staged, just an ordinary moment of connection. "Why that one?" Tom asked. "It's not even from a special occasion." Zoe traced the image with gentle fingers. "Because it shows the truth," she said simply. "That family happens in the everyday moments, in showing up, in paying attention, in choosing each other over and over again." Her wisdom, so hard-earned through years of navigating complex family dynamics, humbled me. At 18, she understood something profound that many people never grasp in a lifetime: that love isn't a feeling but a practice, that belonging isn't bestowed but created, that family, at its best, is a daily choice to see each other clearly and stay anyway. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. I am so proud of the woman you've become. We both are, Tom added, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe smiled, looking between us with eyes that held not just love, but a deep, settled knowing. I had good builders, she said simply. You taught me how to create family wherever I go. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the evidence of our shared history, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, college, career, perhaps someday a family of her own, Zoe would carry with her this most precious understanding, that she belonged. Completely, unquestionably, eternally. Not because anyone granted her that belonging, but because she had learned to claim it for herself, to build it with her own brave hands, to make room for others within its generous boundaries. That, I realized, was the true gift we had given each other over these 11 years. Not just a family, but the knowledge of how to create family wherever life might lead. How to build belonging, even in places where it seems impossible. How to transform exclusion into a more meaningful inclusion through the quiet, persistent courage of showing up day after day, choice after choice, with open hearts and steady hands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.